So I'm going to be talking about the threats to the Weimar Republic. This was in the early years of the Weimar Republic. This is 1919 to 1923. I don't have any notes with me or anything, so I'm basically just ad-libbing off memory. I'm just going off what I know right now. But yeah, so this is for my A-level. Anyone doing A-level at Excel history or just German history, whatever. So basically the main threats to the Weimar Republic in the early years can be broken down into 4 to 5 key parts. The extreme left, the extreme right, the anti-republican right, the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar Constitution, and you can add the economic and social tensions of 1919 to 1923. So basically the extreme left, this is characterized by the Spartacist uprising, the Spartacus League, which was also known as the KPD, which was the extreme left party. The Spartacist uprising actually took place before the Weimar government came into power, but this can be used to argue that the new republic started off on a bad note. The Spartacist uprising was led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and they tried to overthrow the provisional government to create a Soviet-style republic. The extreme left were all about the proletariat and making it a workers' country and communism, like Russia did with the 1917 revolution, and Russia obviously became a communist country. So extreme left was Spartacist uprising. They had uprisings in Bremen and Hamburg. They had the Red Bavaria, which was an uprising in Bavaria in 1919 again. They had the Ruhr Revolution in 1920, and they had the German October in October 1923. None of them were successful, essentially. The extreme left can be summarized as being too weak and too divided to pose a real threat. However, the fear of communism and the perception of the threat of communism was greater than the actual real threat. So in many people's minds, communism was a real threat, and this wasn't helped by the Russians, who were already communists, and the Polish-Russian War, in which Russia came right next to the Polish corridor, but they were pushed back eventually. But the perception of the Red Scare was real, and it took over many people's minds. Then you got on to the extreme right. Well, actually, I'll leave the extreme right for the end. We move on to the Constitution, the Weimar Constitution. Basically, in February, 6th of February 1919, the elected representatives met in Weimar because Berlin was too dangerous, and they became the Weimar Republic. And Ebert was elected president, and he brought in the liberal lawyer Hugo Prius to write up the Constitution. So Prius, along with a constitutional committee, wrote up this new democratic constitution. It was adopted and signed by the president from July 31st to early August. So basically the constitution had six to seven main elements. It had the electorate, the president, the Reichstag, the Reichsrat, the Bill of Rights, the states or Länder, and the chancellor and the cabinet. So basically it stated that the electorate, the franchise, was extended to women in 1920. So anyone over the age of 20 could vote. So the electorate was anyone over the age of 20. Then the president, under the new constitution, the president had a lot of power. The writers of the constitution were trying to put together sort of a mix of the British style of government and the American style of government, but took more parts of the British parliamentary style of government. It created a president, which was directly elected by the people, had a 7-year tenure, and had significant powers, such as the controversial Article 48, which gave it the power to rule by decree in times of emergency. Then there was the Reichstag. That was the lower house, like the and if you do American politics, you know the Congress has an upper house and a lower house. So I think the Reichstag is quite a bit like that. So the Reichstag is the lower house, but it's the most important house. This one makes all the laws. But a key thing to remember is that it was elected through the electoral system of proportional representation. This means that seats in the Reichstag were allocated exactly to the proportion of vote that a party got. This meant that multiple parties could have seats in the Reichstag if they got enough votes. So invariably, proportional representation led to coalition government, because there were many individual parties around the big state of Germany that all got seats. So you never have one party getting over 50%, making it a single party government. Then you have the Reichsrat, which was the upper house, but it was the least important house, the less important house. They had powers of vetoing legislation, but even that, the Reichstag could overthrow or overturn their vetoes. Then you have the Bill of Rights. People were given, like similar to the American Constitution, people were given freedom of speech, freedom to religion, stuff like that. And then you have the states. Like I said before, it was derived from like the American Constitution, which goes on the concept of federalism. So the German Constitution was also going off the concept of federalism. So the states had rights as well. These are also known as Länder. The states are called Länder. They have rights of like policing and education, but they're not as powerful as the central government. So in that respect, it's not really like the American system of government. And then finally you have the cabinet and the chancellor. The chancellor was selected by the president, but only with the approval of the Reichstag. So if it didn't have majority support of the Reichstag, they would have to resign, and that happened a lot. So that was the Constitution in essence. Historians have argued over the strengths and weaknesses of it. Some historians see it as the reason the Republic fell, but that view is it's been seen to be not the full story, because if you look at the Constitution, it's not unworkable. The core to the failure of the Constitution was the parties in government. So the key areas of the Constitution that are seen to be flawed, or that are seen to have brought the Weimar Republic down, would be proportional representation, the powers of the president, and to a lesser extent the federalism of the German Republic. To talk about a bit about proportional representation again, basically, it's the essence that many parties had to work in government, and this is in a Germany where they're like split. There's so many different parties which all act as like interest groups, sectional interest groups, instead of parties wanting compromise and consensus. So if you have so many individual sectional interest groups, legislation can't be agreed on, things can't get done. So there's political dismay and unease in Germany as a whole, and that's generally what happened because of proportional representation. But it's not a fault in PR itself, it's because the parties weren't willing to work with each other. Then you have the executive powers. This as well can be targeted as why the Republic fell, which is a fair enough argument because Hindenburg and Hitler used the executive powers to the detriment of the Republic, but Ebert used it the way it was meant to be used when he ordered the army to put down extreme right putschs, for example. And then you have federalism, which you can sort of throw in there, which was basically, it just complicated the issue. It was not clear the role of the states, and it just made an already complicated, extremely democratic constitution even more complex. So that's the extreme left and the constitution. Now we're going to get onto the treaty. Basically, I think the treaty is similar to the threat of the extreme left in that it was more perceived. It was a perception and the psychological stigma that came with the treaty that was the biggest threat to the Republic. It wasn't the actual terms, because historians have found that reparations, for example, they could have been paid without much damage or too much hardship, stuff like that. And also the land that was given away, Alsace-Lorraine, that was France's anyway. Plebiscites were held, and in the plebiscites such as Upper Silesia and North Schleswig, I don't know how to pronounce that, but the plebiscites were held and they decided to go away from Germany anyway. So in many respects, it wasn't the actual terms of the treaty, the terms of territorial losses, such as parts of Prussia, West Prussia, went to Poland, and Posen went to Poland, and plebiscites, like I mentioned, in Upper Silesia, North Schleswig, and then colonial losses as well. All of the African colonies were put under mandate of the League of Nations. So yeah, it wasn't these provisions that hurt Germany. If anything, Germany would have been fine under the provisions, but the way the people took it and the way the right attacked the treaty is what damaged the Republic. And finally, you have the extreme right. I left the extreme right to last because personally I think this was the biggest threat to the Republic. The extreme right was more than just the violent uprisings. The violent uprisings were the Kaplitz putsch of 1920 that was sort of easily crushed by passive resistance by the people. Then you have the Organization Council, which was a violent organization headed by Erzberger, who was a key member in the Kaputsch as well. They basically assassinated pro-democratic people, but they met their demise in 1922. And then you have the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, which was Hitler and in Bavaria, but that failed as well. But the extreme right extended to the anti-republican sentiments that were floating around Germany for the whole period, and this gradually was eating away at the Republic's credibility and legitimacy, and the anti-republican feeling was in the establishment as well. This is the civil service, the judiciary, and the army. These are key institutions in the German Republic, but they were never for democracy. So they would subtly be undermining democracy, like the judiciary. Their rulings would make it seem like extreme right was semi-legal. So Hitler, for example, for high treason, he was only given 5 years, but extreme left opponents were given 11 years for some things, or even moderates were given. There was a moderate who was given 11 years imprisonment for violating the press law. So there you see the establishment going against democracy, so undermining democracy, and it was these small gradual steps and this anti-republican feeling, the anti-republican right, was the biggest threat to the Weimar Republic, and at the end of the day, it was the extreme right that took the power, and they were growing and growing, and they had so much power. They had the power of elites and the rich, the wealthy, and then they had the violent extremists. So put that together, that's a very credible threat. The left was nowhere near as strong as the right, but because the perception, and the view, the psychological view of the left was so big, the right was overlooked. That once again, it wasn't the Constitution was not unworkable. It was the parties within it, again, the anti-Republican right parties. And then the Treaty of Versailles, it was a perception of it. It wasn't a make or break treaty. It was harsh, but it was the perception. And through these perceptions, the real threat was overlooked. And just going back into the economic situation, there was growing economic hardship from the war, because in the Kaiserreich, the government was borrowing money instead of taxing when they were fighting the army. So there was growing debt, but it reached its peak in 1923, and what happened was the government said they're not going to pay the reparations anymore, which resulted in the French invasion of the Ruhr, which led the government to declare passive resistance on 13th January 1923, but they were still paying the striking workers. So this led to hyperinflation, and hyperinflation went for most of the year, and basically people's lives just were completely shattered, especially the middle class, and many argue that the middle class was crucial in switching tides from pro-democracy to extreme rights, because they lost everything. They had savings, they had their whole lives worth, as well as pensioners. They had everything, but that was all destroyed by the hyperinflation. So basically, in essence, threats to the stability of Weimar can be attributed to the extreme left, the Weimar Constitution, the treaty, and economic hardships, but those are all minimal in comparison to the threat of the anti-Republican